Unpacking a standard. During my clinicals, I will be teaching second grade ESL students. The school I will be teaching at is St. Paul American School in Suwon, South Korea. My school follows the Minnesota Common Core standards, so today I will be unpacking standards from Minnesota's Reading Benchmarks for Literature, key ideas and details for second graders. Under this standard are 3 sections. Students must be able to, by the end of the year, ask and answer who, what, when, where, why, and how to understand key details. They must be able to recount stories, including fables and folktales from diverse cultures, and determine the main idea, lesson, or moral, as well as describe how characters in a story respond to major events and ideas. The first thing I did for these standards was identify the nouns. All of the nouns in this standard involve the story genre as well as the purpose of the story. The next thing I did was to find the verbs in the standards. These revolved around essential critical thinking skills that required students to identify key characters, the story's purpose, and required students to ask open-ended questions about the story they were reading in order to identify the main idea, key details, and other things necessary for comprehension. In order to meet the standards, lessons will be focused on breaking down the story in different ways in order for the students to comprehend not only stories from their culture, but other cultures, in order to expand their global knowledge and ability to further understand stories from other areas of the world. This entire lesson will revolve around one big idea. How do stories from different cultures make the world more interesting? This is an open-ended question that requires students to use the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions they will learn to use in this lesson. It is also a question that doesn't necessarily have a right or wrong answer, so it can be addressed at different levels for students of different abilities. Each lesson will strive to meet different parts of the standard by reading different stories and identifying different things in the stories. The final lesson will be an assessment to see what the students have retained and if reteaching material will be necessary. The first lesson will involve a story that the student is familiar with, and it will teach them how to find a main idea and key details in the story. The questions that they will need to ask are, what are the key details? And what is the main idea? And for the focus question, how do the key details support the main idea of the story? The second lesson will involve 2 stories, one from their own culture and one from a different culture, to show similarities and differences in 2 different stories that have the same idea. The 2 stories in this lesson will come from the Brer Rabbit stories and a Korean story which translated into the hare's liver. Both stories have the same main idea, but come from very different backgrounds and therefore are quite different. The things that they are going to need to ask in this lesson are, how are the stories same and how are they different? Where do they take place? What cultural differences do you see? And who are the characters? With the focus question being, how are the main characters the same? The third story will be from a different culture, and it might be one that the students are not as familiar with. In this story, they will continue to find key details, but the main focus will be summarizing the story and finding the lesson that it teaches. The questions that they would be asking themselves is, what happened? What was the problem? What was the solution? And sort them into beginning, middle, and end. The focus question would be, what is the moral of the story? Or what does it teach? The next lesson will involve multiple stories from around the world and one from their own culture. These demonstrate problems and solutions. It would also tap into their critical thinking skills, where they need to think of their own solution had they been in the same situation as the main character. They need to identify what is the problem, what is the solution, and finally, how would they have solved it? The final lesson would be an assessment, where the students create their own story that demonstrates a problem, a solution, and a moral. This is an open-ended assignment which allows students to not only be creative, but still use the critical thinking skills that they learned in the previous lessons. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation.